All right. Hello and welcome to the Oxygen Addict podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors, precisionfuelandhydration.com. You can personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so you perform at your best with 15% off your first order of electrolytes and carbohydrate fuel with the code OA23, precisionfuelandhydration.com. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm your host, Coach Rob Wilby, and I'm joined by co-host Chris Palfreyman. Chris, how are you doing today?
Hello, everyone. Hello, Rob. Yes, very well. Thank you. Good to be back.
Great to be back. Every week, we bring you an episode of this podcast to help motivate and inspire you. And this one is a cracker. We're going to be talking about tapering for your big race. We're going to focus mainly on tapering for Ironman and 70.3 today, but there are some principles here you can use for tapering for any distance of race. But before we jump in and get started, two things you can do for us, please, if you wouldn't mind. If you do like the episode, enjoy it, please like and subscribe on YouTube or click follow on the podcast subscription system that you're using. And if, as always, you're looking for help or advice with your triathlon coaching, endurance coaching, swim, bike, run, any kind of combination of those, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to help out. So please drop us an email to help@oxygenaddict.com. There's even a link in the show notes. You can book a call to our calendars and you can discuss your training and your goals for the year, and we can see how we can best help you out. And if you are looking for coaching, I think we've got the best overall wound up system of how to coach age groupers for not just triathlon, but swim, bike, run events pretty much worldwide. So please get in touch and have a shout. So Chris, before we go into talking about our taper strategy today, we're just going to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. What we would like you to do, listeners and watchers, is head over to their website at precisionfuelandhydration.com and use their free planning tool. What it'll do is it'll give you a really good lead as to whether you're a very heavy or a very salty sweater. And if you're one of those two, you're going to need some help with staying hydrated. It's not as simple as just drinking water. You're going to have the right amount of electrolytes in that water in order to keep the electrolyte balance and to stay the right amount of hydration. So if you're not sure, if, for example, you finished a long ride in the heat and your kit is caked in salt, that's a really good lead that you're very salty or a very heavy sweater, or like me, both. So please go over and check it out. You'll get tons of free information. Even if all you do is raise your consciousness of, oh, this is something I should be really taking care of, then that's great. We recently have returned from a training week in the French Alps, haven't we, Chris?
Yeah, totally. And I think the amount of precision fuel and hydration that we went through just between me and you was probably quite record breaking. So as soon as the sun was out and our engines were running hot, we were taking in the electrolytes. So yeah, it was a very, very important part of the week for us.
Yeah. Me personally, I go through very close to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat that goes out. So I need 3,000 milligrams of sodium in two 1.5 liter sets of water. So it's a bonkers amount of sodium I've got to keep putting in there. And I was really proud of myself, actually, hands up. I didn't get any of the night cramps that usually plague me with training, especially when we're doing high load training or we're doing training camps. I really was fastidious about putting extra electrolytes in on this camp, and it worked out really well. But you're right, it was, as I was packing my bag to go away for the week, I was thinking, I can't possibly get through all this. I think I had 6 boxes of 1,500 sachets in there, and I got through all but 3 sachets in 6 days of long riding in the Alps. So yeah, it was very good to have something that kept us confident we could keep rolling day by day, because there's enough things to be scared of out there without needing to be worried your own muscles are going to cramp up on you.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome stuff. Right then. So today's episode, thank you, first of all, to the listeners and YouTube viewers who've got in touch to say, look, you said you're going to do an episode on tapering. Where is it? We really need this episode. I know people who are racing very soon as we're recording this are really keen to hear this. And it's one of the key areas where all of the training that you've done in preparation for events, if you mess the taper up, you literally can screw up your chances of having a really good race. And strangely, it's something that's really, really avoidable in the last couple of weeks. And the big danger, just in simple terms, the big danger is you've done tons of training, you've built up loads of fitness, but you've also built up loads of fatigue. So most people 2 weeks out before an event are very, very fit, but they're also very, very tired. And the key thing that we are aiming to do in our taper is we want to shed all of that fatigue whilst maintaining as much of the fitness as we can. So first up, here's my first tip. Your fitness is not going anywhere in the last 2 weeks of an event. If you've trained appropriately, you are not going to get any less fit. You might feel a little bit weird, but even if you don't do anything at all for 2 weeks leading up to an event, your fitness isn't going anywhere. The key thing that screws people up is not resting enough, not getting enough recovery, and not shedding that fatigue. So essentially, they go into race day really fit, but still really tired, and they just don't feel great on race day. So that's what we want people to avoid. It's much better to go in with your fitness starting to tail off a little bit than it is really, really fit, but also really, really tired. It's the absolute key to it, isn't it?
I think the taper is one of these mythical beasts, and everyone knows about it, and people find it very hard to apply to their own training cycle. We are endurance athletes. We're pretty obsessed with the training loads that we do. We've been training for months on top of other months, and it becomes really hard to walk away from that volume. And we think that if we're not training on one day, then we've lost X% of all the gains that we've made. And you just said it really well there, Rob. Even if you do nothing for 2 weeks, your training, your fitness is there. It's within your body. What you have to do is nurture that and put yourself in a position where you're able to apply that full fitness on race day. And the only way to do that is to shred and get rid of that fatigue. For me personally, the way that I approached the theme of tapering, I did quite a bit of research back in the day to get it right for myself. And I always approached it as two separate elements to tapering. One is the physical, which is massively important, but there's a whole other side, which is the mental. And there's a lot of research on the physical out there, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next 20 minutes or so. But also, you're going to have to be really wary of how this taper period affects you mentally. So to give you a bit of an idea, when we're talking about the physical, there was a really interesting study that was peer-reviewed back in 2003, 2004, which was in the Journal of Sports Medicine. And they concluded that there was, on average, a 3% performance gain increase when the taper is done logically. And what we mean by that is by reducing volume, by keeping a level of intensity, but not increasing the intensity to the point of increasing fatigue. So you might be thinking 3%, that doesn't sound massive. Maybe I'll just continue training in that 10 days to 14 days before the race. But let's put that into numbers. A 3% increase on, let's say, 200 watts, which is a round number, that's a 6-watt gain. Now, in what other area of training can you do less training but increase your watts by 6? That's amazing. Same with if you're running a marathon at the end of an Ironman and aiming for around 4 hours. If you do your taper properly, you could expect a 7-minute benefit in your overall time. So these
are massive, isn't it?
Yeah, they're measurable, they're worth doing. And for once, we're turning the tables and we're asking you to train less. We're asking you to really kind of pull back from your desire to be training, which we applaud in any other week of the year, basically. But when we get to taper time, it's time to step back and look after your body, look after your mind. And there's so much going on that we're not even aware of as humans. You know, we're increasing our lactate buffer levels. So hopefully on the day, you'll be able to push harder without the lactate increasing. That's only going to happen if you protect that taper period. Your hemoglobin levels are going to increase, which is going to let you absorb more oxygen on the day. So it's a miracle that's happening by you lying down on the sofa and pulling away from your intense training that you're used to. So I think there's so much to talk about, and it's very hard for endurance athletes to respect the taper, I feel.
Yeah, it's largely a mental challenge for athletes who are often driven by compulsion. And to accept that doing less is going to give you more is a really hard place to start. When I came into the sport, the only book available on coaching was a Dave Scott book. And he quoted anecdotally needing like a 4 or 5 week taper. And that is very true of someone like Dave Scott, and our pros who are training massive volumes. it isn't the case for age groupers. You don't need a 4-week taper. And if you read in several Facebook groups, it's, you know, people are talking with 4 or 5 weeks to go. Well, I've only got 1 more week of training and really then I can ease up and it's all done. That's definitely not the right mindset to go into this in. We want to get you to 2 weeks out. Your longest run, your longest ride are going to be 2 weeks out before race day. And athletes that we coach are actually going to do a massive weekend 2 weeks before their Ironman or 2 weeks before the 70.3. Where they're essentially going to do almost the full distance of the events broken up over a 2 or 3 day period. So that's really the peak of their training. And I think something that would help athletes if we consider the taper to actually be called peaking, because it affects our psychology better. It's 2 weeks to allow our bodies to peak, to get into peak performance shape. And you can't do any more training in that period to affect it. The more training you do is actually going to affect it negatively. So that's our first point. To understand the taper, it's 2 weeks worth of reducing the volume. We're not going to ask you to reduce the intensity, but shedding fatigue is the number one goal. So if we were going to sketch out our standard training week that might have, say, 3 swims, 3 bikes, and 3 runs in it, what we're going to do is take 2 complete rest days at the start of that week before race week. So essentially sort of 13 days before race day, 2 complete days off. This is going to shock your body for people who are used to training once or twice a day and really start the process of shedding the fatigue. That's really, really good thing. However, you're going to start to feel pretty funny. So this is the first thing we're going to talk about here in understanding tapering is it's going to affect both your body and your mind. And we will discuss this phenomenon of taper madness. Essentially, you're going to be convinced that you're not going to race well. You're going to feel physically pretty awful from the Tuesday through to probably about the Wednesday before race day. So physically, you're not feeling great. Mentally, you're not feeling great. The thing that you usually turn to in order to feel better is doing more exercise. You have to really resist that. If you're feeling as though doing more training is going to help you, really, really resist that idea. And come the Wednesday of race week, sort of 3 days, 4 days before race day, you will start to feel amazing. And by the Thursday, the Friday, you'll feel superhuman. But that will only happen if you follow the process. Don't try and do more training in the 14 days than we're going to suggest here. And then in terms of actual structure of our taper, well, not that much is going to change. We're going to keep essentially the same number of sessions in there. We're just going to reduce the duration right the way down. So we talked earlier, didn't we, Chris, about the week before race week. We're going to cut all the sessions down to between 30 and 45 minutes, roughly, depending on how much volume an athlete's been doing. If you've been doing less, you're at the lower end. If you've been doing more, you're at the higher end. 7 days before race day, we're going to let you have a slightly longer ride. So you get to go out for an hour and a half ride with a short 15-minute run off it. And then in race week itself, everything's going to be between 20 and 30 minutes long. So the sessions are getting even shorter at this point. A lot of athletes have said to me, look, it's barely worth putting my running shoes on to go for a 20-minute run. So don't at that point succumb to the idea of I won't bother, because you really will feel rubbish on race day if you haven't done anything at all. But those 20-minute or 30-minute sessions are just long enough to keep your body systems moving, but not long enough to build up any fatigue. What's your experience been, Chris, with getting into that race week itself, starting to feel mentally not great, physically not feeling great, kind of jonesing for a really hard endurance fix? What's been your experience in the races you've done recently?
I always really struggle with the taper.
Yeah.
You know, I like to think that I'm quite a rational being and I understand the processes to make sure that I'm a happy, healthy athlete on race day. But when it comes to race week, I'm all over the place, especially when it's what we'd call an A race, one that you've been aiming for a long period of time, 6 to 12 months. I feel that a taper in the B race is a very different beast, and we can talk about that, how maybe you can flex how a taper looks for that to make sure that you don't have too much of a taper. Maybe
absolutely. Yeah, we shouldn't point that out, actually. This is the taper for the A race, isn't it? This is the one of maybe 1 or 2 times a year you'll use a taper like this. That's a good point. It's really important.
Exactly. Otherwise, you start to impact your overall training plan too much for races that don't deserve that kind of taper. But when it gets to taper week, physically, my legs tend to feel hollow, and it feels like I've totally undercooked myself. I feel like an amateur of all amateurs when it comes to swim, bike, or run. And even going up the stairs, it feels lethargic. It feels like, yeah, hollow, heavy legs. In the morning, I struggle to wake up like I previously did. In the evenings, I struggle to go to bed. It's nothing's logical. Everything is kind of, it feels as if I'm out of my own control and that I've undercooked myself. And I just have to remind myself that that is absolutely not what is happening. This is just the way that the body reacts to um, very consistent and fairly high volume exercise on a daily basis, to suddenly taking that away and forcing your body to revamp. And that is literally what's happening at a cellular level. Your red blood cells are literally regenerating. So that is going to have an impact on how we feel, but we have to respect that. And we mustn't think that my legs feel tired and lethargic, therefore let me go and do a quick blast on the bike of a 20-minute effort to feel how I want to feel. You're going to have to let go of that.
Yeah.
But I can really relate to the athletes that are going to either be going through this process right now as they listen to it, or in the next few weeks as the big events of the year in the UK come around the corner. And I think you just have to separate. You have to separate how you feel physically and use your rational self to pull away from what you want to be doing. This is not the time to be adding anything extra. So I think one tip that I could give that has worked really well for me is to redirect that focus. You know, we've been focused for 6 to 12 months on a very specific goal. And, you know, from the moment we wake up, we're thinking, how can I be a better athlete? You go through the processes of training, you're looking after your hydration, your nutrition, your sleep. But at the end of the day, the most important thing during that period is the training. But now that we're in taper time, put it slightly on the back burner. You're not training anymore. You're just trying to make yourself feel better. So then you can put to the top of your list sleeping. And if you're into metrics, if you're into data, have that as your main metric for the next 14 or 13 days. Literally put it in your training plan of how many hours you aim to be in bed, how many hours you aim to sleep, and record that on a daily basis. And that's suddenly going to focus your mind on, you haven't just let the whole process go. You're still very much in control, but you're in control of different things. That can be the same with your nutrition choices, not just when you're doing these lighter, shorter sessions, but also what you're doing from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. Are you making the right nutrition choices? Are you getting all the vegetables you possibly can? Are you getting the right levels of protein, carbohydrates? Are you stocking up your glycogen stores? All those things have a huge effect in 10 or 14 days time. So now's the time that you can start, you know, being accountable to yourself and essentially being proactive in the taper phase, as opposed to, all my training's done, I'm just going to lay on the sofa, and you're just going to feel bad. That's the taper experience for the majority of people. But if you can turn it into a positive time of, now I'm just going to refocus my energy into making sure that I'm fueling my body to its optimal levels over the next 2 weeks, then come race day, it could be a very different experience for you.
I think it's a real opportunity to take care of the things that everyone knows they should do during training, but only probably the very best people actually do. So when you mentioned sleep and nutrition, they're two things that everybody know on a mental level. They're very important. But when we're hungry, most people will resort to eating anything. Now you've removed the focus on training a little bit. I think your idea of setting a sleep goal, just like it's a session, I will get 9 hours, put it in training peaks, gives your mind something to focus on at a time it's not feeling great. I will have a bowl of fruit after my dinner that will have, I don't know, 4 different kinds of fruit in, or 5 different kinds of fruit in. It's a kind of thing that maybe slips through the cracks when our brains are focusing on training, but you can really make a focus on it, and it will make a difference for race day as well. It gives us just a little something else to focus on at a time when we're not necessarily feeling great, and we can't necessarily turn to, as you said, the usual fix of just jump on the bike for an hour. That can be a really, really hard challenge for people. So knowing that it's coming, having a plan for something else to do rather than trying to get through it. And like you said, recognizing you are going to feel different because things are different. The fact your body's regenerating, the fact your hemoglobin levels are building, that's a really good thing. So if you do feel different, don't worry about it, because it's a period of your year when things are changing and things are a little bit different. I think the key there is focus on resting more and training less. That's the thing. And actually for both Ironman and 70.3 athletes, you can insert periods of training at your goal race pace during this phase without being afraid it's going to burn you out. Especially for Ironman athletes, Ironman race pace just isn't that fast. And that's what you're going to learn during the taper. As you shed the fatigue, you can suddenly realize my goal race pace for this marathon is totally achievable in any kind of run. It isn't, you're not going to click your fingers and be a minute a mile faster than you've been in training, but you're going to start feeling much, much better along the way. Now, you started to mention here the nutrition and hydration angle during the taper. I think we should drill down into this because there's two elements into this. I always think there's, on the one hand, there's all the positive things that an athlete can do that are going to make a positive difference if they focus on it. On the other hand, we have to recognize that an idle mind and a hungry body are often not a good combination. And so really focusing in, even making a list of the foods that we're going to eat for each meal and planning that out as a meal planner, if that's not something you do usually, that can be a real godsend to people, because if you're sitting around with nothing to do, you're tired, you're grumpy, heading for the big bar of chocolate in the fridge is something that a lot of athletes have fallen foul of in the past during the taper. And honestly, we have eating habits built up, especially our Ironman athletes. You can pretty much eat anything at certain points in training and still be getting leaner. That's not going to be the case during the taper. So it's worth really focusing in on controlling the binge eating. Let's put it that way. There's a tendency that happens sometimes, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think a proactive way of being in control of that is you suddenly gained X amount of hours during your week because we're reducing your overall volume. So one thing that you can do is, if you don't tend to do the weekly shop for the family home, put your hand up and say, I've got some time available. And then you go to the supermarket and you make the food choices that you believe are going to be the best for you on race day. Don't put that in someone else's hands, whether it's your partner, husband, wife, or whoever you live with. Take control of that. And one, it's going to ease the burden for anyone else living under the same roof as you, but also it feels really good that you're making that proactive choice, and make sure that you fill the shopping basket with what I'd call productive foods that are going to make you happy and healthy on race day. So, if someone else is coming back with the shopping and their packets of crisps and chocolate bars in there, the reality is at some point you're going to reach for the cupboard and you're going to see it. And once you see it, the likelihood is you're going to eat it. But if it's not getting through the door in the first place, it feels really good actually to take control of those decisions, and at the same time, make the most of that time that you've got suddenly available. You can be a better husband than you have been before, a better boyfriend, just because you've got use of that time. So fill it with stuff that's going to help you be a better athlete on race day.
I'm a massive fan of going to the supermarket and picking up strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, apples, and bananas, chopping them up into a bowl-sized fruit salad. The feeling of pleasure you get from eating a big bowl like that is immense, because there are so many delicious flavors. There are so many micronutrients in there, and there's none of the guilt associated with reaching for a bag of crisps or a chocolate bar. That stuff's really going to help your body during the taper. And so I'd encourage athletes to reframe it that way. It's not, don't think of it as restricting not being able to eat what you want, because the reality is your body's going to be calling out for basically anything. So give it really positive food choices. And, if you have that big bowl of chopped fruit after your dinner every day, it's going to reduce the hunger pangs, but also it's going to be really good for the micronutrients and repair overnight. I think that's a really good thing to focus on. Let's talk a little bit about the end of the taper and the theory of carb loading, because it's something that there's a lot of old school 80s misinformation still out there around carbohydrate loading. And certainly when I was back at university, carb loading protocols were pretty brutal. They involved, like really hard, restrictive few days with high intensity training and then nothing at all with massive volumes of carbs. I'll share a horror story here. I trained for a marathon one year, and almost out of nowhere, the day before race day, saw a big bag of, I can't remember what they were now, a big bag of sweets in the supermarket, and decided that they would be really good for carb loading, and ate this massive bag of dolly mixtures. That's what they were. Convinced it was going to help my marathon. I was sitting around in London with nothing to do in a rented hotel room. What happened was I got an enormous dose of the upset stomach 12 hours before a marathon, because all of a sudden I've flooded it with 500 grams of sugar. The body doesn't know what to do with it. So that's not a strategy that you want to follow. But that being said, there is definitely an ability the body has to store a significant amount of glycogen. And we're talking in the realms of sort of 400 grams plus in the muscles and another 100 grams in the liver. That will be a significant help to you on race day. So we want to try and keep those as topped up as we can. Now, you don't have to reach for loads of sugary foods. I'm a really big believer in keeping it really simple. And rice is my personal go-to for carbo loading because it's very low in fiber. It's very low in sort of actual processed sugars, which is very easy, I think, to pick out on cakes and whatever sweets and things the day before. I don't think that's a great idea. But extra rice in the 2 days, the 3 days leading up to your event will make sure your glycogen levels are topped up. And that's all most people need to do. You don't need to be super saturated with carbs. You just need to make sure that your stores are full and ready to go for race day morning.
That's spot on. And I think rice is a great choice, not only because of the ease of digestion usually and the low levels of fiber, but also it's a food type that you can find in most places. So it doesn't really matter where you're racing. The likelihood is you're going to be able to find that rice, and that's going to be your main body of the meal. Off the back of that, what I would suggest is that whatever meal you perceive as your optimal race meal, make sure that you've had 1 or 2 meals of that in the weeks leading up to it. So obviously a great time to do that is in your final, what we call a race simulation weekend, or your final big sessions. Make sure that the night before and that breakfast are as close to your identical race day breakfasts and meals. Because we've heard horror stories from many athletes in the past who have tried a different food, who have tried a nice spicy curry before Ironman day, and we know how that ends up, and we want to avoid that. So whatever you want to use on race day and the day before, make sure that you've been through that process. And it's going to feel so good when you actually get to that race time, knowing that you know that it's easy to digest. It doesn't stop you from sleeping. It's very easy for you to consume. You're excited about eating it. All those things play a really important part to how you're actually going to feel on race day. I've got one more small point on, it kind of links with our theme of sleep and also what to consume and not consume. And I think a lot of athletes look over this theme, which is caffeine. So a lot of us are caffeine drinkers, whether that's tea, coffee, or energy drinks. We're so used to having that caffeine to help us through the long days at work and the long days of training. But in this 2 weeks, try and make an active decision to slowly but surely reduce that caffeine. One, it's going to help you sleep, and you might find a little lull during the day. That's okay. Embrace it. If you've got the option, have a 10 or 20-minute lie down if you can. That's going to really help get over this little lull during the day. But more importantly, it's going to help you sleep in the evenings. You're going to wake up with a bit more spring in your step. But on race day, if you are a caffeine user through gels or even coffee in the morning, for example, your body is going to react in a more positive way and have a greater impact if it's had a version of taper with caffeine intake as well. So if you're a caffeine user, try and slowly decrease it. Nothing kind of major. You don't need to cut it from one day to another. If you're a 3 coffee a day drinker, try and reduce that to 2 and then 1, and then potentially nothing, or change to a cup of tea, for example. And then on race day, you can go back to your original race plan of gels that might have 75 or 100 milligrams of caffeine per hit, which is great. It's going to feel like absolute rocket fuel. But for it to feel like rocket fuel, you're going to need to taper that off as well.
And something else I think on the caffeinated gels is make sure you've tried them in training. Don't try something new, especially with a caffeinated gel on race day. So make sure you've tried it in training. And you're right, they very often do feel like rocket fuel to people, but use them sparingly.
Mm.
It, I think you've got a maximum of 2 or maybe 3 caffeinated gels in you in an event. It's a pretty strong stomach that can take more than that. So forewarned is forearmed. It's one of those, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
In terms of hydration in the taper, something that is often overlooked, I think, is as we're reducing the amount of training that we're doing and we're increasing the amount of food, we might also find that we have to increase the amount of fluid and electrolytes that go along with it. So one thing we've had success with is not just drinking water in race week, drinking the mixed, obviously we are big fans of pH, but electrolyte neutral drinks as you're having them. So for me, that involves mixing pH a lot of the time and drinking it rather than just a glass of water. I'll have a glass of pH, and that allows me to just not accidentally. It's quite common for me if I get thirsty needing to drink a pint of water not long before bedtime that hasn't got electrolytes in it. It's effectively washing some of the electrolytes or at least diluting it in my bloodstream. So really keeping a track of having a little bit of extra electrolytes, and the same for race day morning as well. I think any drink you have, make it electrolyte neutral for whatever you've worked out is the right level for you and your body.
I've got a small warning shot off the back of that. I totally agree with what Coach Rob just said there, but this is an ongoing conversation which I've had with a lot of athletes over the years, and it's to do with weight management. And taper time and race weight is a time where a lot of athletes can lean towards thinking lighter is better.
Yeah.
But off the back of what Rob has just said, naturally, if you're hydrated to optimal amounts, and if you're making really good food choices, but basically totally replenishing your glycogen stores, the likelihood is that your body weight is going to increase. That's a good thing. Embrace it. Don't get on the scales in the morning thinking, oh no, I'm a kilogram over my perceived optimal race. That's taper time is the opposite. It's the time to be carrying some water weight, and that's going to be reflected on the scales. So you'll see the scales increase, but if you're doing it through the kind of healthy options, which is really good hydration levels and really good food choices, your body weight's going to go up. Absolutely fine. Don't freak out. You need to be going through that process to race well on race day.
That's a really, really good point. And I would even go as far as to say, look, it's a great idea to not weigh yourself during race week, because we want this to happen. And if you consider every gram of carbohydrate stores with it 4 grams of water when it's stored in your body. If we do manage to stock up with 500 grams of carbohydrate, that's like an extra 2 kilos of water that comes along with it as well. So in an extreme example, although I very much doubt we'd ever see this, but someone going from completely carb depleted to completely carb full in a short period of time could put on 2.5 kilos. Now, that isn't 2.5 kilos of fat. It's just fuel. But there are some people who will be very negatively affected by that. And I think that's a large reason why people's weight fluctuates so much. If we get people who weigh themselves every single day, it's easy to think that a light day is a good day and a heavier day is a bad day. It's not that your body's magically put 1.5 kilos on overnight, but it might be that you've stocked up with some, you've eaten some rice and your body's stored some water with it, and there's 1 kilo. So it isn't the end of the world. And actually, it's not going to be in anyone's favor for you to be weighing yourself during race week and be having doubts. Above all, we want you starting with those full carb stores. And I've even read people say, I was reading just the other day, Chris, on the internet, someone saying, I don't think carbohydrate loading is a good idea because I don't want to feel heavy on race day morning. And it's like, why would you start the Le Mans race with an empty petrol tank in a car? It's a ridiculous idea. It's just how it is. Your body stores the water with the carbs, and it can use the water stored with the carbs. That's a really good thing. So we want it in there.
I had a very tangible experience of that at Ironman Kona in 2019, where they weigh every athlete as you walk into transition and also straight after the race. And that's basically a health safety thing. And if you've lost too many kgs, then they send you to the medical tent. And I wasn't sent to the medical tent, but I'd lost 5 kilograms. So the moment that I saw that on the scales myself, it made me realize, oh God, in the days and hours pre-race, I've got to factor that in. I'm going to be losing a huge amount of weight. And yes, the majority of that was water weight that I'd lost because of the dehydration levels. But you've got to factor that in. So if, I'm using round numbers, but if you're thinking that your optimal weight is 80 kilograms, for example, that's at the start line, but you've got to think that at the finish line, you're going to be losing a lot of that because of levels of dehydration and just the amount of calories that you're going to be burning through. So don't fall into the trap of, being a slave to the scales in those 2 weeks. And I think your advice there of in the taper week, move away from all the metrics that we've been using. One of them might be weighing yourself on a weekly basis. When it comes to taper time, look after your body. And that means in a holistic way, basically the body that you have now 2 weeks out is the body that you're going to have on race day, and that's what you want. So don't be looking for any extreme weight loss. We've seen some horror stories in the past and definitely want to avoid that now.
Yeah. And we don't want people restricting themselves in the last 2 weeks. We want people to be well fueled going into the race. And any sort of mindset of restriction, I think, is going to lead to trouble come race day for sure. Now, that's not to say you should go to Greg's and buy yourself 4 sausage rolls, but sensibly eating, we've discussed all the sensible food options you can have. I think that that's the way to go. While we're on that, I'm just gonna debunk this myth. I don't know if you've seen this, but going around on the internet recently, there's been this standing joke in several Facebook groups that sausage rolls are a really great food to have on race day because I don't want to eat anything sweet. While I completely understand not wanting to eat anything more sweet on race day, what we have to think is, what are your food choices going to be on race day if you don't fancy something sweet? A sausage roll, a pork pie, anything like that is not going to be the optimum way to be fueling carbs into your body. So my top tip is actually pretzels. You can get pretzels into a top tube bag on a bike. They've got some salt on them. They've got loads of complex carbs in, which is great fuel for race day. And a few of those in your mouth with some water is a great way to take away the sugary taste. So, and I don't even feel I should have to say this, but I do obviously have to say this. Pork pie, a sausage roll, something with loads of processed meat in it is not going to be easy to digest on race day as you're moving at any kind of velocity. And I'm sure there are people out there who have fueled a race on Greg's vegan pasties or whatever, right? But that isn't to say that that's the optimal way of doing it.
No, totally. And we're going to always caveat these kinds of sentences with have the pretzel as long as you practice with it more than once, not just in taper week, but in the kind of simulation sessions that are going to basically replicate the kind of intensity and duration that you're going to be out there. It's very different having these foods in the comfort of your own home on the sofa watching TV versus 150 beats a minute for 6 hours on the bike. Very, very different. So it's not just about how it feels, but it's also about the rates of absorption, which is something that you can only practice out on the bike and out on the run. So as always, don't be practicing these things in taper week. Practice them beforehand. If you haven't practiced them beforehand, put them on the back burner. That'll be for next year. Absolutely fine. Anything that you go through as a process or that you consume, that you've able to basically consume, absorb, and perform well off the back of it.
100%. Now, our final point to talk about in this episode is the mental preparation that happens during the taper. And this is a great place to wrap up the episode, I think, Chris, because it's so important to underline to athletes, even athletes who've done multiple races before. The mental aspect of tapering can be so difficult to deal with. The unexpected feelings, both mental and physical, of how things are different in the 2 weeks before race day. It might be that things don't change that much for you, but I think for the majority of people, you are going to experience some form of taper madness where you are suddenly convinced that you either A, have no fitness and the race is going to be a disaster and you should go do more training right away, or B, that your body feels so strange that you should head out through the door and do more training. Almost all of these thoughts are going to be focused around heading out of the door and doing more training, aren't they? So it's just to reassure people that's totally normal. We've given people some ideas in this episode today of things that they can do and focus on in the race week that isn't actually training. But I think it just bears repeating again, doesn't it? That it is going to be a strange 7, 8, 9 days for people. So as long as you're prepared for it, that's going to help you get through it.
I think another low-hanging fruit, if you're going through that similar kind of difficult taper week, is head out for a short walk. And I mean, really short. That can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. No longer. You're not power walking. It's just really relaxed. Go to your favorite bench, sit there, read the newspaper, listen to a podcast, do whatever you want. But heading out the house is usually a good process to clear the mind. And that fresh air on a daily basis is going to essentially trick you that you are actually being active and doing stuff without increasing any load, anything like that. So that's one thing that you can do on a daily basis. Another one is, and correct me if you disagree, Rob, is doing some really light mobility work. So this is nothing that includes weights or basically even body weight. But if you're sitting on the sofa, you can roll your ankles. Roll your ankles in in a nice slow format, which is basically just helping your range of motion. So you can do that between basically all your joints, your shoulders, around your hips, your knees, your ankles and feet. And just that is going to help basically produce the synovial fluid, which is what we tend to do in a warm-up. So you can still do that without adding any extra load, any extra fatigue, but it will feel good. It's basically a really, really light warm-up. You're not warming up for anything. You're just getting that range of motion. And that's going to help you walk up the stairs without feeling absolutely terrible. So if that's a low-hanging fruit, I'd go for it.
I like that. And like you said, I'm a really big fan of athletes getting out of the house, getting into nature, getting away from screens. If you can avoid spending 4 extra hours on a smartphone or a computer, really positive. A walk through the forest, sit by the canal, all of those things I think are really positive for people's mindsets. And it's that's going to help people feel calm when they've got a lot of things to be nervous on. And one last idea from me, if you're short of something to do, get yourself your front wheel, practice changing a tire, practice changing a puncture, practice changing an inner tube if you're on tubes. Make sure you know how to plug a hole if you're on tubeless. Have those plans for what will happen. And while it is too late to do something new for race day, I am a big fan of people putting new tires on for race day. I think lots of people put 2, 3, 4, 5,000 miles on their tires and then come to race day. It's well worth having spent, upwards of, who knows, 500 to 2,000 pounds on a race and travel. The extra £100 for a pair of decent race tires to go on your bike in the 2 weeks before race day. Give yourself the time to try them, obviously, before you get to the point where you go to race day. But I think you're totally safe putting new tires on for new race day. I'm a big fan of a new chain about 3 weeks before a race as well. We might be too close to races as we're recording live for some of the people who are racing some of the big races in the UK. But a fresh chain and maybe a fresh cassette on the bike, I think is not a bad idea at sort of 3 weeks to go.
Oh yeah, there's loads of kind of low-hanging fruit there. Chain, cassette, making sure that no brake pads are running, new brake pads, new bar tape can really help with comfort on race day. Make sure that every single bolt is nicely torqued up to the specification. All those things that we've seen too many people lose bottles, bottle cages, pedals coming loose, all that stuff. That's well within your control. And these 2 weeks are the time to do that. Rob, my final point is the athletes that we coach will be very used to this, which is our race day planner. And that's basically to help with this mental aspect of controlling the controllables. So to a new listener, our race day planner is a document that we point all our athletes to go through. And it's essentially writing in bullet point format every detail that comes to mind when it comes to pre-race, during the race, swim, bike, run, transitions, all the processes that go within that, nutrition, hydration, everything, how they're carrying bottles, how they're lacing up their shoes, flying mounts or not, watches, data fields, everything that you can think of. It's written down in a logical order. So the athlete becomes accountable to themselves. They've cleared their mind because it's on paper. The coaches can have a look over it and look for any anomalies or guide them towards maybe slightly different ideas. But the 2 weeks before race day is when you really need that clarity of thought, and writing it down is the key for that. So my kind of final point would be write it down. and be in the most detail to, go crazy with it, go to every detail possible, and then cross-check it with someone that is either doing the same race or has been through a similar experience, ideally a coach, because they'll be able to look through a coach's lens, which is really useful. But share it. Don't just put it in your bottom drawer and think job done. That's only the first part. You need to share it. You need to stress test it, so you can play the what if game. What if you lose a bottle? What if the temperature changes? What if my zip doesn't do up? All those things. So you've got a plan A, B, and C for the majority of the scenarios that you could come across. And then you're going to sleep well. If you know that you've got that plan, it's been checked, it's been stress tested, and you believe in it, and you believe in it for, full body belief in that is the best plan for you. Come race day, you're going to feel fresh, you're going to feel focused, everything's ready for you. And I think that a lot of the athletes are spiraling when it comes to race day, because they're thinking, oh, should I be doing that? Should I be taking a gel 20 minutes before the gun goes everyone else's? Should I? I've never done that before. Blah, 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 blah. It all spirals. But if you've got that clarity of thought and you've been through a process that you truly believe in, then you've already got a massive head start on the person standing to the left or right of you.
Yeah. I think the writing it down thing is so important. The having it written down on a document that you can refer to somehow transfers all the worries out of your head and onto the paper. And once they've gone out, and to a certain extent, you've written down the things you can control and you've got a plan for it. If you write down the things you can't control, well, you can't control them regardless. There's no point worrying about whether you're going to have a spokes break in your wheel, because if you do, your race is over. There's no point worrying about it at this point. But you can put a plan in place for having a puncture, because you practice changing a puncture. Have a plan in place for what if it rains really heavily on the bike, because you've put spare socks into your run bag, things like that. So the things you can take care of, you don't have to worry about. And the things you can't take care of, you've got no control over, you don't need to worry about as well. It's all about reducing that amount of mental worry to really get the best out of an athlete on race day, isn't it?
Totally. One point that we've got, which is basically the final point within our race day planner, is all about race day mantras. And it sounds a little bit wishy-washy, and a lot of the athletes are probably thinking now, I'm going to switch off. This is not for me. I've got a really solid mental game. But actually, in the 2 weeks before is when you're likely to be deviated in your really positive thoughts. It's very easy to think, actually, I don't care about this race as much as I thought. I'm going to be looking at other races down the line. That's all the irrational that's coming in as basically a self-protection mechanism, because it's the fear of failure, which as athletes, we're all very common. If you can be really, really strong with your mental thoughts, really positive, and let the negative thoughts come in because they're natural, but have a mantra to protect yourself of, these thoughts are going to come in, but I do care about race day, and I've got processes to make sure that I'm going to fulfill my full potential on race day. So don't let all these kind of negative thoughts, and it's the paradox of the chimp that's in our minds, and that chimp voice gets louder and louder and louder. But you've got to make sure that you're resilient. You're really resilient physically because you've been through this whole training process, but mentally, you have to be ready to start fighting from 2 weeks out, not just on race day, but 2 weeks out. Be resilient and remember why you're here, because you really cared. You cared 6 months ago, you cared 12 months ago, and you want to make your future self really proud. So in these last 2 weeks, don't let the negative thoughts override and stifle your full potential. Grab the opportunity with both hands. We don't know how many more races any athlete has. So as far as we're concerned, this is the only race that matters. So you know what to do. Go full steam ahead, stay rational, and be really, really strong mentally.
Brilliant. That's a great thought to leave it on, Chris. I think you don't know how many more races you've got in you, and you're right, it might be the last one. So take care of all the details and make it count. So we'll wrap this up on Tapering then. If you are racing soon and you've been listening, we wish you all the best. I hope you have fantastic luck for race day. I hope you have fantastic fitness and experience, and just savor every single minute. Go out and really have a great time and make use of all the fitness you've built up with all the hard training that you've done. And with that, we'll wrap this up. So here are some discount codes and deals for you at precisionfuelandhydration.com. You can use the code OA23 for 15% off your first electrolyte order. And at teamoxygenaddict.com, I think we've got the most comprehensive endurance sports coaching program for busy age groupers. So whether you're a triathlete, a runner, a cyclist, a swimmer, or any combination of those, we'd love to help you achieve the best you can next year. So get in contact. There's a link in the show notes to book through to our calendars if you're interested in coaching. We'll have a chat and find out about you and how we can best help you out, get prepared for race day. So great stuff. There's links in the show notes for all of these things, so you don't need to remember them. And until next week, have a great, safe training and racing week. I'm Coach Rob Wilby, and he's Coach Chris Palfreyman, and you've been listening to the Oxygen Addict podcast.